The rain began just as the final guests were leaving the cemetery. Gray clouds hung low above the quiet town of Cedar Hollow, turning the afternoon into something heavy and somber. Black umbrellas dotted the small hill where people had gathered to say goodbye to Thomas Whitaker, a respected school principal who had spent nearly 4 decades shaping the lives of local students. People spoke about him with admiration. Some remembered his patience, others his humor. Many remembered how he never gave up on struggling students. But while the town mourned Thomas Whitaker, one person stood at the center of the loss. His widow, Margaret Whitaker, stood beside the grave, her hands clasped tightly together. At 72 years old, she carried herself with quiet dignity, though the grief in her eyes was impossible to hide. She and Thomas had been married 47 years. Nearly half a century of shared breakfasts, long conversations, raising a son, and slowly building a life together in the same white 2-story house on Oak Ridge Lane. Now she was alone. Their son Daniel stood beside her, occasionally placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. He had always been a good son, quiet, responsible, respectful. But grief had made him distant today, his expression unreadable. Daniel's wife, Caroline, stood a few steps behind them. Her black coat was elegant, her hair perfectly styled despite the weather. She looked appropriately mournful to anyone watching. But Margaret noticed something else in her daughter-in-law's eyes. Impatience. After the burial, guests moved toward the nearby church hall where coffee and food had been arranged. Margaret accepted hugs and condolences, her smile faint but polite. Inside, the hall buzzed with quiet conversation. Margaret tried to remain strong, but the constant sympathy became overwhelming. "I'm so sorry for your loss," felt like another stone placed on her chest. Eventually, she slipped away unnoticed. At the end of a hallway there was a small sitting room used for private family gatherings. The lights were dim, and the room was empty. Margaret lowered herself slowly into a chair. Only then did the tears finally come. Her shoulders shook as she pressed a handkerchief to her face. The silence of the room allowed the grief to pour out in waves she had been holding back all day. Thomas was gone. Her partner. Her best friend. The man who had once told her that no matter how old they grew, they would always face the world together. Now the world suddenly felt far too large. She had no idea how long she sat there. But eventually the door opened. Margaret quickly wiped her eyes, preparing to stand, but the people entering the room didn't notice her. The large floral arrangement beside the chair partially hid her from view. 2 familiar voices filled the room. Daniel and Caroline. Margaret froze. She hadn't intended to listen, but something in Caroline's tone stopped her. Sharp. Cold. "We should have handled this before he died," Caroline said quietly. Daniel sighed. "Caroline, please, today isn't the day." "When would have been the day?" she replied. "Now we have to deal with everything after the fact." Margaret's heart began to beat faster. Deal with what? There was a pause as Caroline adjusted her purse. "You need to call the attorney on Monday," she continued. "We need to know exactly what your father left and how quickly everything can be settled." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Caroline, my father's funeral just ended." "Yes, and your mother isn't getting younger." Margaret felt a strange chill run through her body. Caroline lowered her voice slightly, but Margaret could still hear every word. "The sooner we sort this out, the better," she said. "The house alone must be worth $500,000 now." Daniel hesitated. "She's not going to want to sell." Caroline laughed softly. "She won't have much choice." Margaret stopped breathing. "She can't manage that place alone," Caroline continued. 2 floors, a big yard, constant maintenance. It's completely impractical. "Maybe she could stay with us for a while," Daniel suggested uncertainly. Caroline's answer came instantly. "No." The word echoed sharply in the quiet room. "Our house is already busy enough," she said. And honestly, your mother and I have never exactly seen eye to eye. Daniel remained silent. Caroline leaned closer to him. We move her into a retirement community, she said matter-of-factly. Sell the house. Use the money for Emma's college fund, and maybe finally upgrade to a better neighborhood. Margaret's hands trembled. Retirement community. They were planning her future, as if she were an object. As if she were no longer capable of deciding anything for herself. Daniel spoke again, though his voice sounded uncertain. She might not agree. Caroline shrugged. Then we convince her. Another pause. Then Caroline said something that made Margaret's stomach drop. Hurry things along with the inheritance. The old lady will adjust. The old lady. Margaret felt the words strike like a slap. For a moment she couldn't even process what she had heard. Her own daughter-in-law had just referred to her as the old lady. And Daniel said nothing. After a few seconds he finally spoke, but his voice lacked conviction. Let's talk about this later.
Fine, Caroline said.
But the housing market is perfect right now. We shouldn't waste time. Their footsteps moved toward the door. Moments later the room fell silent again. Margaret remained frozen in the chair long after they were gone. Her mind replayed every word. The old lady, the house, the nursing home. She slowly stood and walked to the small mirror hanging on the wall. The woman staring back at her looked older than she remembered. Grief had carved new lines into her face. Was this how they saw her now? Fragile, useless, a burden. As she returned to the reception hall, one memory suddenly resurfaced in her mind. 3 weeks before his death, Thomas had been lying in the hospital bed, weak but still sharp-eyed. He had squeezed her hand. Margaret, he had said quietly, I've taken care of things. She had assumed he meant finances. I know the future may look uncertain, he continued, but I promise you'll be protected. At the time she had thought he was simply trying to comfort her. Now, walking through the church hall filled with strangers, Margaret wondered something else. Had Thomas known? Had he seen something in Caroline that Margaret had ignored? Had he prepared for this moment? That evening Margaret returned home alone. The house on Oak Ridge Lane felt eerily quiet without Thomas's presence. His reading glasses still rested on the coffee table. His gardening gloves still hung beside the back door. Every room held a memory. Margaret walked slowly through the house, touching familiar objects as if they might anchor her to the life she had just lost. But Caroline's voice continued to echo in her mind. Sell the house. Move her out. The old lady will adjust. Margaret stopped in the hallway and closed her eyes. For the first time since Thomas died, something besides grief began to rise inside her. A quiet determination. If her husband had truly prepared something, then perhaps this story wasn't over yet. And somewhere deep inside, Margaret Whittaker felt certain of one thing. Thomas had never been a man who left things unfinished. Morning arrived slowly over Cedar Hollow, washing the quiet streets in pale sunlight. The Whittaker house on Oak Ridge Lane looked exactly the same as it had the day before. The white shutters still framed the windows, the small garden still stretched along the walkway, and the maple tree Thomas had planted 30 years earlier still shaded the front yard. Yet for Margaret Whittaker, the house felt completely different. The silence inside was heavier now. Every room carried the unmistakable absence of her husband. She woke early, long before the town had begun to stir. Sleep had been shallow and restless, her mind replaying the conversation she had overheard after the funeral. Caroline's words echoed again and again. The old lady will adjust. Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. For years she had believed that her son's marriage had simply created a distance between them. That was natural, she told herself. Children grew up, started families, built their own lives. But what she had heard yesterday felt different. It wasn't distance. It was calculation. The thought made her chest tighten. Still, another memory surfaced, one that brought a small measure of comfort. Thomas's words in the hospital. "I've taken care of things." Margaret didn't yet know what he meant, but Thomas had always been a careful planner. During his long career as a school principal, he had solved countless problems simply by thinking ahead. If he had sensed something troubling before his death, he would have prepared for it. Margaret took a slow sip of tea and tried to steady her thoughts. Whatever was coming, she needed to remain calm. Just as she stood to refill the kettle, a knock sounded at the front door. Margaret checked the clock. It was barely 8 in the morning. When she opened the door, Caroline Whitaker stood on the porch holding a casserole dish covered with aluminum foil. Her expression was warm and sympathetic, her smile carefully practiced. "Margaret," she said gently, "I brought breakfast. I thought you might not feel like cooking today." Margaret studied her daughter-in-law for a moment. The performance was flawless. If Margaret hadn't overheard the conversation yesterday, she might have believed it. "That's very thoughtful," Margaret said politely, stepping aside to let her in. Caroline walked into the house as if she had lived there herself. Her heels clicked softly against the hardwood floor. "I made vegetable quiche," she said, heading straight toward the kitchen. "Daniel said you always liked it." Margaret followed behind her. Caroline placed the dish on the counter and immediately began opening cabinets, searching for plates. Margaret watched quietly. After a moment, Caroline frowned slightly. "You really should reorganize these shelves," she said casually. "Everything's a bit crowded." Margaret felt a flicker of irritation. Thomas had built those kitchen shelves with his own hands 20 years earlier. Every jar and dish had its place. "I've managed just fine with them," Margaret replied calmly. Caroline turned, the faintest hint of surprise crossing her face before her polite smile returned. "Of course," she said quickly. "I just thought I'd help make things easier." Easier. The word hung in the air. Margaret sat down at the table while Caroline sliced the quiche. For several minutes they ate in silence. Then Caroline cleared her throat. "Daniel and I have been talking," she began. Margaret waited. "We're concerned about you being here alone," Caroline continued gently. "This house is quite large for one person." Margaret looked around the kitchen. 2 bedrooms upstairs, a small office, a living room, a modest yard. It had never felt large before. "I've lived here nearly 30 years, Margaret said quietly. "Yes, but things change," Caroline replied. "Maintaining a home like this can be difficult as people get older." Margaret folded her hands. "I'm 72, she said evenly. "Not 90. Caroline gave a soft laugh. "Of course, but it's better to think ahead. We've been researching some wonderful senior living communities nearby." Margaret's stomach tightened. Right on schedule. Caroline reached into her handbag and pulled out several glossy brochures. The covers showed smiling gray-haired couples walking through manicured gardens, dining in elegant halls, participating in art classes. Margaret flipped through one of them slowly. Everything looked pleasant, comfortable, safe, and completely foreign. "This place is only 20 minutes away," Caroline continued enthusiastically. "Private apartments, medical staff on site, daily activities." "I'm not moving," Margaret said calmly. Caroline blinked. "I'm sorry." "I'm not moving," Margaret repeated. The room fell silent. Caroline leaned back in her chair, clearly caught off guard. "Well, no one said it had to happen immediately," she said carefully. "But it's something we should begin planning." Margaret set the brochure down. "Thomas and I discussed our future many times," she said. "We decided this was where we wanted to stay." Caroline tapped her fingernails lightly on the table. "Thomas isn't here anymore," she said quietly. The words felt like a sudden gust of cold air. Margaret met her gaze. "No," she said. "But his wishes still matter." Caroline's smile tightened. "I'm only trying to help." Margaret nodded. "I'm sure you are." There was another brief silence. Then Margaret spoke again. "By the way," she said casually, "I noticed something interesting yesterday." Caroline's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Oh." Thomas had several meetings with Mr. Bennet, our attorney, during the last month. Caroline's fingers stopped tapping. "Yes, that makes sense," she said carefully. "Updating legal documents is common when someone is ill." Margaret watched her closely. "Do you know when the will reading is scheduled?" "Daniel mentioned it might be later this week," Caroline said. "I'm not sure exactly when." She stood abruptly. "Well, I should probably get going. I have a charity luncheon this afternoon." Margaret nodded politely. At the door, Caroline paused. "Margaret," she said softly, "just remember, Daniel and I want what's best for you." Margaret gave a faint smile. "I'm sure you do." After the door closed, Margaret returned slowly to the kitchen. The brochures still sat on the table. She stared at the smiling elderly couples printed on their covers. For a moment doubt crept into her thoughts. Maybe Caroline truly believed she was helping. Maybe everyone eventually reached a point when they had to give up their homes. But then Margaret remembered the conversation she had overheard. "The house alone must be worth $500,000. The old lady will adjust." Margaret closed the brochures and slid them aside.
No.
This wasn't about concern. This was about money. That afternoon, she made an important phone call. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Samuel Harris, Thomas's longtime physician. "Margaret," he said warmly, "how are you holding up?" "As well as can be expected," she replied. "But I actually wanted to ask you something." "Of course." "Did Thomas ever speak to you about my future?" There was a brief pause. "Yes," the doctor said slowly. Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "What did he say?" "He asked me to keep an eye on you," Dr. Harris replied, "and to be prepared in case anyone questioned your ability to live independently." Margaret felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest. "He thought that might happen?" she asked softly. "Yes," the doctor said. "In fact, he asked me to prepare a written assessment confirming that you are perfectly capable of living on your own." Margaret closed her eyes. Thomas had known. "He asked you to write it already?" she asked. "Yes," Dr. Harris said. "I finished it last week. I can bring it to you tomorrow if you'd like." Margaret felt something shift inside her. Grief was still there, but beneath it, something stronger began to grow. Resolve. "Yes," she said quietly. "I'd appreciate that very much." After she hung up the phone, Margaret stood by the window looking out at the maple tree in the yard. Thomas had planted it the year Daniel started kindergarten. It had grown strong over the decades. Roots deep, branches wide. Margaret took a slow breath. If her husband had prepared for what was coming, then she would honor that preparation. Because one thing had suddenly become very clear. The conversation at the funeral had only been the beginning. The real battle had not even started yet. 3 days later, the sky above Cedar Hollow was clear and bright, as if the town itself had decided to move on from the gray morning days that had followed Thomas Whitaker's funeral. But inside Margaret Whitaker, the tension had only grown. The meeting at the attorney's office was scheduled for late morning, and since sunrise she had been pacing slowly through the house on Oak Ridge Lane. Every creak of the wooden floors, every familiar sound of the house reminded her of the life she had shared with Thomas for nearly half a century. She paused in the living room, her gaze drifting to the armchair by the window. Thomas used to sit there every evening reading the newspaper, occasionally looking up to share some piece of news that amused or annoyed him. The chair remained exactly where it had always been, but now it stood empty. Margaret straightened her coat and picked up her purse. Whatever Thomas had prepared, she was about to find out. The offices of Bennett and Harper Legal Services stood on the corner of Main Street, a quiet brick building that had been part of Cedar Hollow for decades. Thomas had trusted Mr. Harold Bennett with their legal affairs for years. Margaret arrived a few minutes early. Inside, the waiting room looked exactly the same as she remembered: leather chairs, framed photographs of the town from decades past, and a small table stacked with magazines no one ever really read. Daniel and Caroline were already there. Daniel stood when he saw her enter. "Mom," he said gently, "how are you holding up?"
"I'm managing," Margaret replied.
Caroline offered a polite nod. Her expression was carefully neutral, though Margaret noticed the way her eyes briefly scanned Margaret's purse, as if the contents might somehow reveal the future. The three of them sat in uneasy silence. Daniel flipped through a magazine without reading it. Caroline checked her phone twice, then her watch. Finally, the office door opened. Mr. Harold Bennett stepped into the waiting room. He was a tall man in his late 60s with neatly combed silver hair and the calm, deliberate manner of someone who had spent decades delivering both good news and bad. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said warmly. "Daniel."
"Caroline."
"Please come in." They followed him into his office and took seats around a polished wooden table. A thick folder rested in front of the attorney. Mr. Bennett adjusted his glasses and looked at Margaret first. "Before we begin," he said, "I would like to express my deepest condolences. Thomas was not only a client, but also a friend." Margaret nodded quietly. "Thank you." Mr. Bennett opened the folder. "Thomas Whitaker's will is relatively straightforward," he began. "As his surviving spouse, Margaret, you inherit the family residence on Oak Ridge Lane and all of its contents." Caroline shifted slightly in her seat. Mr. Bennett continued. "The joint bank accounts were already shared between you and Thomas, so those assets remain fully in your control." Margaret listened calmly, though her heart beat steadily faster. Daniel seemed unsurprised by this information, but Caroline leaned forward slightly. "And the investment accounts?" she asked. Mr. Bennett glanced at her briefly before continuing. "Thomas maintained a retirement account valued at approximately $480,000. Margaret is listed as the primary beneficiary." Daniel nodded. Caroline's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. Then Mr. Bennett turned another page in the folder. "However," he said slowly, "Thomas added a specific clause 3 months before his passing." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. This was it. The clause concerns the house on Oak Ridge Lane. Caroline sat up straighter. "The property is granted to Margaret Whitaker with full lifetime residency rights," Mr. Bennett said. Margaret exhaled quietly. But Mr. Bennett was not finished. "Upon Margaret's passing, or if she voluntarily chooses to sell the property, ownership will transfer to Daniel Whitaker." Daniel nodded again, looking relieved. Caroline allowed herself a small smile. Then Mr. Bennett raised a finger. "However, there is an important condition attached." The room grew still. Mr. Bennett's voice remained calm and precise. "If Margaret Whitaker is ever pressured, manipulated, or forced to leave the home against her will." Caroline's smile vanished. "Or if any attempt is made to remove her from the residence without the written recommendation of 2 independent medical professionals stating that she can no longer live safely at home." Mr. Bennett paused. "In that case, the property will not pass to Daniel Whitaker." Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Mr. Bennett closed the folder slowly. "The house would instead be sold, and the proceeds would be donated to the National Alzheimer's Research Foundation in memory of Thomas Whitaker's mother." Silence filled the office. Margaret stared at the attorney, stunned. Thomas had anticipated everything. Daniel leaned back in his chair, confused. "Dad thought someone might try to force Mom out of the house?" Mr. Bennett's expression remained neutral. "I cannot speak to Thomas's reasoning," he said. "I can only explain the legal terms he established." Caroline's face had turned pale. "That clause is ridiculous," she said suddenly. Mr. Bennett turned toward her calmly. "It is legally binding. But no one is forcing Margaret to do anything," Caroline insisted quickly. Margaret said nothing. Mr. Bennett continued. "There is also an additional provision." He opened another document. Thomas created a trust fund specifically intended to cover home maintenance, property taxes, and in-home assistance if Margaret ever requires help in the future. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. Even at the end of his life, Thomas had been thinking ahead, thinking of her. Mr. Bennet then reached into the folder again. Thomas also left personal letters. He handed an envelope to Margaret. Her name was written in Thomas's familiar handwriting. Another envelope was passed to Daniel. Caroline stared at the table. "There isn't one for me?" she asked. Mr. Bennet shook his head. "No, Mrs. Whittaker." Caroline's jaw tightened. Margaret slipped her letter into her purse. She wanted to read it alone. Mr. Bennet closed the folder. "Are there any questions regarding the will?" Daniel cleared his throat. "Can the clause about the house be challenged?" Caroline looked at him sharply. Mr. Bennet folded his hands. "Anyone can attempt to contest a will," he said calmly. However, Thomas took several precautions. He opened a drawer and removed a small flash drive. The signing of this amendment was recorded on video. Thomas also completed a cognitive evaluation to confirm he was fully competent when the changes were made. Daniel slowly nodded. "I see." Mr. Bennet stood. "In that case, Martha will provide copies of the documents at the front desk." Outside the office building, the tension between them exploded almost immediately. "This is unbelievable," Caroline snapped. Daniel looked uncomfortable. "Caroline, your father clearly designed that clause to control everything from the grave." Margaret spoke quietly. "Or perhaps he simply wanted to protect me." Caroline folded her arms. "No one is trying to hurt you, Margaret." Margaret held her gaze calmly. "Then you have nothing to worry about." Caroline said nothing more. Margaret walked to her car alone. Her purse felt heavier now with the letter inside. When she returned home, the house felt different again. Not empty this time. Protected. She made a cup of tea and sat in the bedroom she had shared with Thomas for nearly 50 years. Then she opened the envelope. The letter was short, but every word carried Thomas's voice. "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are facing the future without me. I know this will be difficult, but I also know your strength. In the last few months, I noticed things that troubled me. I heard conversations that made me worry about what might happen after I was gone. I trust our son, but I also know how easily people can be influenced. So I made arrangements to protect you. This house is yours for as long as you wish to live in it. Do not let anyone rush you into decisions you are not ready to make. You have always been stronger than you realize. We may bend in life, Margaret, but we never break. All my love."
Thomas.
Tears slid down her cheeks as she held the letter. For the first time since the funeral, Margaret did not feel alone. Thomas had left her something more powerful than money or property. He had left her time. Time to grieve. Time to live. Time to stand her ground. And Margaret Whittaker suddenly realized something important. The battle Caroline had started was far from over. But now Margaret knew something Caroline didn't. Thomas Whittaker had already made the first move. The days after the reading of the will brought a strange calm to the house on Oak Ridge Lane. From the outside, everything appeared normal. The maple tree in the front yard swayed gently in the early summer breeze. Neighbors walked their dogs past the white fence, and the quiet streets of Cedar Hollow carried on with their usual rhythm. But inside the Whittaker family, something had shifted. The clause in Thomas Whittaker's will had changed the balance completely. Caroline knew it. Margaret knew it. And Daniel, though he said very little about it, was clearly beginning to understand just how much his father had anticipated. 3 days after the meeting with the attorney, Margaret was watering the flowers along the front walkway when a familiar car pulled into the driveway. Daniel stepped out first. Caroline followed. Margaret turned off the hose slowly. She had expected this conversation to happen sooner or later. Caroline approached with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Margaret," she said warmly, We thought we'd stop by and check on you. Margaret returned the smile. That's very kind. Daniel hugged his mother briefly before stepping back. You look good, Mom. I'm doing all right, she replied. The three of them moved inside, settling into the living room. Sunlight streamed through the windows, lighting the room that had once been filled with Thomas's steady presence. Now it held tension instead. Caroline was the first to speak. I've been thinking about the will, she said carefully. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. So have I. Caroline leaned forward slightly. That clause about the house, it really complicates things. Margaret raised an eyebrow. In what way? Caroline hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Well, it creates a situation where no one can have an honest conversation about your future without risking serious legal consequences. Margaret watched her calmly. I don't see it that way. Daniel shifted in his seat. Caroline just means… I know what she means, Margaret said gently. Caroline exhaled slowly. All I'm saying is that Thomas put everyone in a difficult position. Margaret's expression softened, but her voice remained steady.
No, Caroline.
Thomas protected me. The room fell quiet. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Mom, no one is trying to force you out. Margaret met his eyes. I hope not. Caroline sat back in her chair, clearly frustrated. You're making this sound like some kind of conspiracy. Margaret said nothing. Caroline continued. The house is worth nearly $500,000 in this market, she said. That's a significant asset sitting here unused. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Unused? Caroline gestured around the room. It's a large property for one person. It's my home, Margaret replied calmly. Caroline's patience began to thin. And someday you may not be able to maintain it. Someday, Margaret agreed. But that day hasn't come. Caroline opened her mouth to respond. Before she could, the front door opened. A young voice called out from the hallway. Grandma? Margaret smiled. In the living room, Emma. A moment later, Emma Whitaker stepped inside. At 17, she carried the same thoughtful eyes as her grandfather and the same quiet determination Margaret had begun to recognize in herself. Emma stopped when she saw her parents sitting there. Oh, I didn't realize you guys were here. Caroline forced a smile. We came to check on your grandmother. Emma glanced between the adults, sensing the tension immediately. Everything okay? Daniel nodded quickly. Just talking. Emma dropped her backpack on the floor and walked over to Margaret. Grandma helped me with my history essay last night, she said proudly. She remembers things about the 70s that aren't even in our textbook. Margaret chuckled softly. History gets more interesting when you've lived through it. Emma sat beside her on the couch. Caroline cleared her throat. Emma, we're discussing adult matters. Emma raised an eyebrow. I'm almost 18. Daniel sighed. Emma? But Margaret placed a gentle hand on Emma's arm.
It's all right, she said.
She can stay. Caroline looked clearly uncomfortable with that decision. But she continued anyway. As I was saying, Caroline said, the practical issue here is planning ahead. Emma frowned. Planning what? Daniel hesitated. Caroline answered instead. Your grandmother's living situation. Emma blinked. What's wrong with her living here? No one said there's anything wrong, Caroline replied quickly. But it's something we should think about long term. Emma looked around the room. This house is fine. Caroline sighed. You don't understand yet. As people get older. Grandma is 72, Emma interrupted. Not 90. Margaret hid a small smile. Caroline looked irritated. Age affects everyone differently. Emma leaned forward slightly. Grandma still drives. She cooks better than anyone I know. She volunteers at the library twice a week. Caroline pressed her lips together. Emma, this is more complicated than that. Emma crossed her arms. No, it isn't. You just want to sell the house. The room fell silent. Daniel's eyes widened. Emma? But Emma continued. I heard you on the phone yesterday, Mom. Caroline froze. You were talking to that real estate guy again. Daniel turned slowly toward his wife. Caroline? She stood abruptly. I was simply gathering information. About selling Mom's house? Daniel asked. Caroline straightened her shoulders. About preparing for the future. Margaret spoke quietly. The future seems to arrive very quickly these days. Caroline turned toward her. I'm trying to be practical. Margaret stood. So am I. She walked to the small table beside the couch and picked up a folder. I've already scheduled an evaluation with a home safety specialist. Caroline blinked. A what? They're coming next week to assess the house for modifications. Daniel looked surprised. What kind of modifications? Grab bars in the bathroom. Better lighting in the stairwell. A medical alert system. Emma nodded approvingly. That sounds smart. Caroline looked stunned. You're spending money upgrading the house? Margaret smiled faintly. Thomas created a trust specifically for that purpose. Caroline opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since the conversation began, she seemed unsure of what to say. Daniel looked at his mother with a new expression. Respect. You've really thought this through, he said. Margaret nodded. Yes. Caroline turned toward him sharply. Daniel, this isn't just about safety. That house could secure Emma's future. Emma shook her head. I'm not trading Grandma's home for my college fund. Caroline looked stunned. That's not what I meant. Emma stood up. You just said it. Margaret gently touched Emma's arm. That's enough. But Emma wasn't finished. Grandma shouldn't have to defend her own house. Daniel sighed deeply. Emma turned toward him. Dad, you know she's right. Daniel looked between the three women. Then he spoke slowly. Mom stays where she wants to stay. Caroline stared at him. Daniel. No, he said firmly. Dad made his wishes clear. The room fell quiet again. For the first time since Thomas's death, the tension began to shift. Caroline looked around the room, realizing she had lost control of the conversation. Finally, she picked up her purse.
We should go, she said.
Daniel stood reluctantly. Emma hugged Margaret before her parents left. Don't worry, she whispered. I'm on your side. Margaret smiled. As the front door closed, she looked around the living room again. The house no longer felt fragile. The lines had been drawn. And Margaret Whittaker realized something important. She wasn't facing this alone anymore. Summer settled gently over Cedar Hollow, bringing warm evenings, blooming gardens, and the familiar hum of cicadas drifting through the quiet streets. For Margaret Whittaker, the passing weeks had slowly reshaped life in ways she had not expected. The house on Oak Ridge Lane, once filled with grief and tension, began to feel alive again. It didn't happen overnight. Grief had its own rhythm, and there were still mornings when Margaret woke up reaching for the empty space beside her. There were moments when she caught herself expecting to hear Thomas's footsteps in the hallway or his voice calling from the living room. But time, as it always did, moved forward. And with it came change. The home safety assessment took place exactly as Margaret had planned. A kind middle-aged specialist named Laura Jenkins walked through the house with a clipboard, carefully inspecting each room while explaining simple improvements that could make daily life easier. Honestly, Laura said after finishing the inspection, this home is already very manageable. A few small adjustments will make it even safer. Within 2 weeks, grab bars were installed in the bathroom, brighter lights were added to the staircase, and a small medical alert system was connected beside Margaret's bed. None of the changes altered the charm of the house, but they quietly strengthened Margaret's independence. Daniel came by often during those weeks. Sometimes he helped with small repairs. Sometimes he simply sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee and talking with his mother. Their conversations had grown deeper than they had been in years. One evening they sat together on the back porch as the sun dipped low behind the maple trees. Daniel stared out into the yard where he had once played as a child. I didn't realize how much Dad worried about this, he admitted. Margaret nodded slowly. Your father was very observant. Daniel sighed. I should have seen it too. Margaret placed a hand gently on his arm. You're seeing it now. That's what matters. Daniel hesitated before speaking again. Caroline is still frustrated. Margaret gave a small smile. I imagine she is. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. She thinks Dad's clause was unfair. Margaret looked toward the garden Thomas had loved so much. Sometimes fairness depends on perspective. Daniel nodded quietly. There was a long pause before he added something else. Our marriage has been tense lately. Margaret did not look surprised. I'm sorry to hear that. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. Dad's letter made me think about things I've ignored for a long time. Margaret looked at him carefully. Your father always hoped you would think for yourself. Daniel gave a tired smile. I think I'm finally starting to. Despite the tension between Daniel and Caroline, the family had not completely fractured. In fact, something unexpected began to emerge.
Emma.
Margaret's granddaughter had become a quiet but powerful presence in the household. She visited nearly every afternoon after school during the final months of her senior year. Sometimes she helped in the garden. Sometimes she worked on homework at the kitchen table while Margaret prepared dinner. The house no longer felt empty. One afternoon in early June, Emma walked into the kitchen with a thoughtful expression. Grandma, she said, I've been thinking about something. Margaret set down the dish she was washing. That usually means a big idea. Emma grinned slightly. I'm serious. Margaret dried her hands.
All right. Tell me.
Emma pulled out a chair and sat down. You know how I'm starting college in the fall? Margaret nodded. Emma had been accepted to State University, only 20 minutes from Cedar Hollow. Well, Emma continued, I've been looking at the dorm costs. Margaret smiled. Yes, college housing can be expensive. Emma leaned forward. So, I was thinking, what if I didn't live in the dorms? Margaret blinked. You mean commuting from your parents' house? Emma shook her head.
No. She paused.
I mean living here. Margaret stared at her in surprise. Here? Emma nodded eagerly. It would save a lot of money. And honestly, I like it here. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest. That's very kind of you, Emma, but college is about meeting people, having your own experiences. I can still do that, Emma insisted. Campus is close. I'll still spend most of my time there. She hesitated before adding something softer. And you wouldn't have to be alone. Margaret sat down slowly. The idea had never crossed her mind. The house had always been large enough for more than one person. Emma watched her carefully. I'm not saying you need help, she said quickly. I just like the idea of us looking out for each other. Margaret felt her eyes sting slightly. You're a remarkable young woman, she said quietly. Emma smiled. I get it from Grandpa. When Daniel and Caroline heard Emma's plan later that week, the reaction was mixed. Daniel looked thoughtful. It's actually not a bad idea, he admitted. Caroline, however, was clearly uncomfortable. You can't live with your grandmother instead of experiencing college life, she argued. Emma crossed her arms. I can experience both. Caroline glanced at Margaret. This arrangement might send the wrong message. Margaret raised an eyebrow. What message would that be? Caroline hesitated. That you need supervision. Emma laughed. Grandma doesn't need supervision. She's the one supervising me. Daniel couldn't help smiling at that. Eventually, after several tense discussions, Caroline reluctantly agreed. Emma would move into the second bedroom that fall. And just like that, the future Caroline had once imagined began shifting again. Autumn arrived with crisp air and golden leaves drifting down Oak Ridge Lane. Emma moved into the house a week before her college classes began. She filled the spare bedroom with textbooks, bright posters, and the lively energy of youth. Margaret found herself adjusting to a new rhythm. Mornings began with the two of them sharing breakfast before Emma left for campus. Evenings were filled with stories about professors, new friends, and the challenges of college life. Sometimes Emma studied quietly at the kitchen table while Margaret read in the living room. The house no longer echoed with loneliness. Even Daniel noticed the difference. One evening he stood on the porch watching Emma carry groceries inside. "She's happy here," he said. Margaret nodded. "So am I." Daniel looked around the yard thoughtfully. "Dad would have liked this." Margaret smiled softly.
Yes.
"I think he would." Caroline still visited occasionally, though her relationship with Margaret remained polite rather than warm. The topic of selling the house rarely surfaced anymore. Daniel made sure of that. Whenever it did, he ended the conversation quickly. "Mom stays where she wants to stay," he would say. And that was the end of it. Nearly a year after Thomas Whitaker's funeral, Margaret visited his grave on a quiet spring morning. Fresh flowers rested in her hands as she stood beside the headstone. "I'm doing all right," she said softly. The breeze rustled through the nearby trees. Emma moved in. "Daniel visits often. The house is still standing just like you wanted." She paused, looking at the carved letters of his name. "You were right, you know." A faint smile touched her lips. "I bent, but I didn't break." Margaret placed the flowers beside the stone. Then she turned and walked back toward her car. Back to the house on Oak Ridge Lane. Back to the life that was still unfolding. At 73 years old, Margaret Whitaker had discovered something she hadn't expected to learn so late in life. Losing everything did not always mean the end.